Good evening. My name is Tom Loftus. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics. I'm here from the great state of Wisconsin, where I served as the Speaker of the House for the past 8 years. In 1990, I ran for governor and was the Democratic nominee, and the people felt that the Kennedy School needed me. First, welcome to the alumni. We're happy that you're here. It's Alumni Weekend, and it's fitting since the speaker tonight spent time at the Kennedy School in 1973 when he was a county commissioner. Senator Paul Tsongas is a partner at Foley, Hoag, and Elliott. He's a graduate of the Yale Law School and Dartmouth College. After graduating from Dartmouth in 1962, he served as a volunteer in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia from 1962 to 1964, and spent another year as a training coordinator for the Peace Corps in the West Indies in 1968. Mr. Tsongas was first elected to public office in 1969 as a Lowell City Councilor. He went on to serve one term as Middlesex County Commissioner, 2 terms in Congress representing this state's 5th District. In 1978, he was elected to the United States Senate. During his 6 years in the Senate, Mr. Tsongas was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Small Business Committee. He served 1 full term in the Senate before retiring in 1985 to return home to Massachusetts. Senator Tsongas uses the experience and expertise gained during his years in public service to serve the diverse group of businesses and individuals that make up his clientele. Mr. Tsongas also serves on several corporate and educational boards. Well, that's enough for his official biography. I spent some time this afternoon reading this, A Call to Economic Arms, the New American Mandate, by Paul Tsongas. As you can see, it is not an imposing-looking document. There's no glossy cover, no pictures. It's single-spaced, big words. And this might be the first presidential race where voters will be asked to Xerox their own campaign literature. He's for America. One gets the impression that it was written with a sense of urgency, that the author felt time was running out, and written with some rage at a political system that elevates people who promise us cake, then feed us debt. It's real apparent that the author feels the 2 great political parties are ideologically moribund, and it's affecting the health of the American democracy. And these are truly the words of a man with a stake in the next generation, for he listens for the thoughts and the words of his children. He may be a sheep among wolves, he may be a physician among the sick, but tonight he's among friends. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Tsongas.
Thank you. Well, at least I'm not accused of being a wolf among sheep, which would have been perhaps even worse. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Harris Wofford, who was the director of the Peace Corps in Ethiopia when I was there. You're supposed to applaud, you know. This is, The reason I've decided to do this is I think what the country needs is a Kennedy School dropout. I came here, I took 2 courses. One was on political thought from Aristotle on. There's always a Greek somewhere in the political discussion. One of my countrymen here. The other course was, how does Congress work? And when I finished that, I ran for Congress. I figured I wanted to see it for myself and dropped out. My strategy for 1992 was to come back to the Kennedy School, take a course on how the White House works, drop out, and I will be elected. If you run for public office in this country as a Harvard graduate, you have no chance whatsoever. But if you drop out twice, you have real appeal. My father attended Harvard and got out during the Depression and was not able to finish. And it was something that he was always very sorrowful about. And then when I decided to drop out of the Kennedy School, he was really quite upset, but he was a Republican, so, you know, it can't be, that had to be lived with. I know for some of you that my running for president seems rather improbable. It's somewhat improbable to me, too, I must say, at times. But you're in pretty good company. My favorite story, and I have 1,000 of them because I've been through it the last month, is when people close to me find out what I'm thinking and what their reaction. Somewhere back there is someone who we've known for years who was on my staff and has gone on to the private sector. And we're very close friends. His wife and my wife are extremely close. And my wife at one point said, I can't keep this inside any longer. I have to tell Lynn. So she'd call in to tell her what we were thinking of doing, at which point Lynn freaked out, needless to say. And she says, you've got to tell Fred. So she gave Fred the telephone, and Fred said, well, what's going on? He said, well, you got to keep this quiet, but I'm going to run for president. This long silence, and he said, of what? And so it's funny in the retelling, but it wasn't very funny. I sadly have a lot of those stories. But the country's going to have to get used to me because I'm going to be out there. I gave to you, that was a great applause line, which you also managed to. I thought these were alums who had graduated and had a better sense of politics. And, in the future, we'll have somebody walk behind me with the card that says, applaud, hiss, whatever the case may be. Despite the speaker's kind introduction, we have reduced this, and there's actually a picture inside. But at least it's not a Chairman Mao type huge picture, which, but this is what I'm running on. And I was reading today, I've been trying to get rid of a chest cold, so I was sitting out in the sun, which today was our monthly allocation in Massachusetts. And I was reading a book by Robert Shogan, who I think you may, the LA Times reporter, and he made a reference to the '88 campaign, which he said it did not do much for the mind. One thing about this campaign is that there's going to be more ideas out there, and when it's all said and done, people will not be able to say there was no substance in this campaign. I expect you to read this and commit it to memory, and there'll be a quiz at the end of your weekend. The reason I'm running has to do with what I see happening to this country. And as the speaker said, I really don't have much faith in either party at this point. And the choice I have is to remain a lawyer here in Boston. I make a lot of money. Every lawyer makes a lot of money, far more than they deserve. And I don't mind that. And so I could drive every morning from my home in Lowell to Boston, be passed by all the Infinities and BMWs, and watch the country go into decline, and say to myself, well, I'm making my money and I'm protecting my family, and whatever happens, happens. Well, I can't do that. I grew up in Lowell during its decline. I know what decline feels like. My father was a businessman, and we worked very hard, all of us, and yet we were caught in the relentless decline the city was going through. Someone the other day accused me of having a depression mentality. You know, people who grew up during the Depression save more than everybody else because they remember what it was like. And I guess I'm, in some respects, I am a product of the mindset of going through decline. And once you've been through it, you don't want to go through it again. You don't want your children to go through it. And you sure as heck don't want your country to go through it. And that is, I think, what is at stake here. Now, my argument for our economic peril is in this, but it's really numbers. It's not rhetoric. When Reagan Bush took over, the national debt was less than $1 trillion. Reagan Bush, by the time this term is over, will have added $3 trillion of debt. Now, get past all the rhetoric and all the, we support the balanced budget amendment. That is the reality. So when the president said, read my lips, no new taxes, what he said really was, read my lips, add more debt. And add that debt and give that debt to our children. That is generationally immoral. Politically successful, and he was elected, but someday his great-grandchildren will look at him and ask, why? If the answer is, I had to do it to get elected, at least I will never face that discussion with my grandchildren. The other number is trade. When Reagan Bush took over, we would trade surplus. Japan and Germany would trade negative, and now, you know, it's totally reversed. $910 billion of trade deficit. That's a number, but what it means is we're for sale. And part of what I've tried to think about in these several years is, and I commend, by the way, a piece that Bill Moyers did when he spoke to the Democratic Congressional Caucus about generational responsibility and community. And he quoted in the speech, he said that in Apache, the word for grandfather and grandson is the same word. So there is a sense that you live not only for this, but you have a sense of what came before you, and you have obligations that run in that direction, and you have responsibilities to those that come after you. If you think of all the work that was done by our forebears to create this great nation, and our generation is the one who happily is going to let that be purchased, and what is the responsibility then to what all the work they did? They didn't do all this work for us to squander it, not pass it on. They gave it to us for our keeping, and that is an enormous moral obligation. And what I object to is that this country has to be rallied because we can be the best again. There's nothing wrong with us. We have more natural resources. If you were out in a satellite and looked down on the earth and somebody said to you, pick the country that has the greatest wealth of natural resources, you'd pick the United States. And we have the most diverse population. There's nothing wrong with us. We just don't have the leadership. And the leadership is to start off and say, hey, folks, we got a problem. And let's start dealing with it. And what I object to about the administration is they're never going to say it because it happened during their watch. And if you never say to people, we've got a problem, let's start dealing with it, then everything you do is marginal. And the slide continues. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, the Democratic Party, I'm sad to say, really doesn't offer, at this point, the country a choice that's credible, because we are fundamentally anti-business. I remember walking on the House floor. I don't know how strong-armed you were in your approach, Mr. Speaker, but I walked on the House floor once, and there was a vote. And one of the leaders said to me, "The vote is no." Very substantive discussion. The vote is no. And I said, "Well, can you give me a bit more?" He said, "It's pro-business." And in his mind, that was all he had to say. That I, as a Democrat, would vote no because it was pro-business, therefore. Well, the fact is that we Democrats who care passionately about social programs and their funding must realize that if there's no economy, there's no money for the social programs. That is so simple and fundamental, and yet we have to have a battle to make that point. If you don't create wealth, you can't redistribute it. It's fundamental. And we have to be the party of economic rebirth. We have to be the party of economic nationalism. And we have to introduce the notion of economic patriotism in this country. Now, I'm not a protectionist. Part of what the Democrats have done historically is to do foreign bashing. It's great politics. It's like read my lips. It's the counter, the other side of the coin. But the problem with foreign bashing is that it doesn't solve the problems we have. I mean, other countries have really taken advantage of us, and we have to be tougher than that. But our problem basically is between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And we have to rally our country and to begin to talk about things like productivity, things like quality control of the products, getting management to look at labor as human beings and just somehow things that are out there. That is a mindset change. I think we have to talk about discipline and will and those kinds of values that were not appropriate in the 1980s. But if I thought that we could not be the preeminent economic power on earth, if I did not think that we have a lot of work to do to create a societal culture that is viable, unlike what's happening in our cities, I wouldn't do it. And I'm absolutely convinced that the American people are ready for substance, ideas, vision. I'm going to lay it all out. And this is going to be a campaign which finally gives the American people a choice. All I can do is present the choice. I have no control over what happens. But I need, when this is over, to have a sense that what I'm thinking has been presented. And I will tell you that, and I'll end with this and give you a chance to ask particular questions. I wrote a book in 1980, said a lot of the same things, actually had a glossy cover, I'm embarrassed to say. No pictures, so I guess it kind of balances out. I ran around the country because I wanted to change the Democratic Party. And I did all the usual talk shows. Have you ever been interviewed in the process of running around the country? What happens is they ask you the same questions that they asked the last author with no change. So if I had done a book on safe sex, it would have been exactly the same questions. It was a waste of time. And if you want a forum, baby, this is the forum. I haven't even announced yet, and yet I've had more impact on trying to redefine the Democratic Party than all the things I did in all the years that I was in office. So I just end with my strategy very simply is job number one, sound the economic alarm. Get the numbers out there, make people realize the peril that we're facing and what it means to our standard of living. Secondly, then change the way the Democrats think, make us the party of economic rebirth and viable economic programs. We can get into that during the questions. And only after you've done that can you then presume to take on the president. And the president is extremely popular. But, you know, it is that which gives us the opportunity. Because finally the Democrats are in such despair, they will finally say, well, we've lost 5 out of 6. You know, those of you who are not from Massachusetts don't recognize Red Sox angst. If the Red Sox won the World Series, we would simply not have a culture left. And the Democrats, you know, there's a purity to losing. I once had my apologies to Lexington, but when I ran for Congress, a woman came up to me from Lexington, and she said, it was wonderful that I'd won. She said, she said to me, you're the first candidate I ever worked for who won. And she was a liberal, of course. And I said, well, gee, that's very nice. And she said, well, I'm not so sure. She says, now I'm going to have to watch what you do. And I'm going to have to apologize for all the things that you do. She says, losing is easier. I don't share that view. If you're going to make the changes, you have to be in there. And the Democrats are going to have to recognize that the fight is in the middle. And that fight is winnable because the Republicans have taken positions on economics which are avoidance politics. And every businessman in this country, in his heart, in her heart, recognized that 4 more years of this administration and their avoidance politics, that trying to be competitive in 1996 is going to be virtually impossible. They know there has to be a change. I'm sending this to every CEO and every director of the Fortune 500 companies. No Democrat would ever have done that before, because it would only cause them to be more Republican. But I believe that the average businessman and businesswoman in this country can look at this and say that makes more sense what they're getting out of the administration. And why I think it's important is that we as Democrats care about social programs, care about children, care about the environment. So if we can give the country a viable economy, we can safeguard the traditional values that make the Democratic Party what it is. I think that's the combination. I think any other combination, we're doomed to be a minority party for the foreseeable future. So I'm pleased to answer your questions. If you could, I guess, use the microphone, indicate which political party you represent, and I can control it from here. So, thank you. I know it would be good to bring relatives here. It always. Yeah.
Hi, I was here in 1988 and 89 as a mid-career student. You had, I believe, just resigned at the time because of illness. You started tonight by saying that you were, or you said tonight, you were in the sun, I think, to shake a cold. I heard a couple of sentences, probably several, where I thought they were clipped by a shortness of breath, and I heard a couple of coughs. Do you have the stamina, and are you healthy enough to run for president?
Could I answer you first by anecdote? I don't mean to be Reagan-esque, but if I could. Well, one of my memories of Harvard was being invited to give the commencement at Harvard Medical School. I had been in office all those years, never been invited to give a commencement at a medical school. I got cancer. And within 3 months, I got 3 invitations from 3 medical schools. And when I did the commencement at Harvard Medical School, I had a lymph node that was swollen in my throat. And I got up to give the commencement, and I just looked out at this audience of doctors. And I knew they weren't listening to a damn word I said. And they were all... And I had the sense of what it might be like, with the focus on my throat, to have a date with a vampire. That this was the focus of attention. And I have a chest cold. There's nothing un-American about. If the weather were better here, I wouldn't have a chest cold. It's part of the reason I'm going to Iowa, where they have. But more seriously, I went through a bone marrow transplant. It'll be 5 years this August. In January, I went to the doctors and I said, this is what I'm thinking about. At that point, I was thinking either writing a book, asking somebody else to run and supporting them, running just in New Hampshire, or running all out. And I said, this is what I'm thinking about. Give me every test you have, not only for cancer, but also stress, cardiovascular, that kind of thing. And when we finished, they said, you're fine. You can do whatever you want. Now, they're available to answer all the reporters' questions. But, that doesn't solve my problem. So, at the end of this month, I will be swimming in the National Master Swim Competition. I competed last year in the regionals. I competed 2 weeks ago in the regionals. And at the end of this month, I will swim. And, it's great to be 50 because now these 40-year-olds mean nothing to me. And so I will compete. And I would challenge anybody who questions my health to swim next to me. And if you can beat me.
Thank you.
If you think it takes courage to run against a president who's got 91% favorability, that is nothing compared to being 50 years old and being photographed in a Speedo. When you see the pictures at the end of the month, you will really... I will be sucking my stomach in for hours on end and will be unable to do the announcement on the 30th because I will be incapacitated by stomach cramps. But I'm one of the ads we were thinking of doing was to do an ad with me doing the butterfly. The people who were thinking about it weren't sure that drowning was really the way to make the point. So, the final thing I would say, by the way, on that issue, whether you agree or disagree, I've been through a lot, and I make no bones about that. But I have a hard time believing I'm a lesser person for what I've been through.
Senator, I got a copy of your, I guess the 8.5 by 11 version and scanned through it and was very impressed. One thing I noted, and I dropped you a note regarding this, is that you do make appropriate and I think very personal reference to health there. What I think you want to do, and you probably are already doing, is talk about health care policy at the same level as you talk about the 6 main headings you have in there, because in talking about economic competition, it's very clear that the other players, or the other international contenders we're facing with, very often come out better on that, even though they classify as high-cost economies. And we may have some of the most attractive medical facilities here, but the distributional problem stinks. And I'm just wondering what you got to say to that.
Well, I think that obviously health care means a lot to me. In terms of catastrophic health care, I want everybody to have what I had, a chance to survive. So you've made me so self-conscious of coffee now that when you don't want to cough is when you start coughing. So there's so we will have a proposal on health care, but unless you have an economy that works, the revenues will simply not be there. And the notion that high cost means a lesser capacity to trade. Germany has the highest cost of labor, highest hourly wage, and they have the highest trade surplus. Before Reagan-Bush came in, we had the highest hourly wage, and we had trade surplus. We now have, I think we're like 9th in hourly wage in the world, and we have this enormous trade deficit. So some of the bromides you hear about, well, if we have high costs, we can't compete. What you compete with is quality and educated people and discipline, those kinds of things, which hopefully will get the economy back and we begin to have. If you have people who have no hope of medical care, it has a corrosive effect on the cohesion of a society, and I feel very strongly about that.
Thank you. I think the point that I was also making is something you converged on too, which is these countries are treating citizen health as a national asset, which hasn't been the policy here yet.
Well, the last chapter in here, by the way, is the one I'm most proud of, and it is has the most intangible, which is the issue of culture. Harris Wofford and I were talking earlier. I taught in Ethiopia for 2 years. If you go to any American high school, however deplorable it might be, kids there had more than what my students had in Ethiopia. And I could look down the street and in a distance see one of my students, and just by the color of the shirt and the pants I could tell who the student was, even though I couldn't see the face because of the poverty. And yet, that so-called primitive culture valued education. Somehow, these people who lived in what we call tukels, grass-thatched huts, valued education and gave that to the children. And part of what the American Renaissance is going to be about is a discussion of values. All the government programs in the world don't bring that about. And where does discipline come from? Where does esteem come from? Where does hard work come from? Not from the 80s. Michael Milken's $500 million a year is a powerful message. It's a powerful message about values. And a lot of American youth were gravitated towards that call. And I think, but there's no happiness there. Think of the people you know who are wealthy and are givers. They're very happy people. There's a peace to them. Think of people you know who are wealthy and hoard it all. They're miserable. It's a matter of what the value system is. And I think the great advantage of a presidency is you can begin a discussion in this country about some very fundamental aspects of human behavior. And I think values is where we begin. And we're sort of embarrassed to do those things. We're embarrassed to talk about spirituality. Well, we're going to have to get over the embarrassment. And particularly we as Democrats are going to have to get over that and begin to talk about things that are fundamental to human existence. People acted like the culture exists and will always be here. It's not true. Cultures are very fragile. And they have to be nourished and talked about and reinvigorated. And I think that is appropriate in the political debate.
I hate to ask you this question, but I figure I'd get it over with in a more sympathetic audience probably than the National Press Corps. But if you were to be elected president, would you raise taxes?
Any other questions? Well, let me answer you this way. The last amendment that I sponsored as the United States Senator was a budget freeze. Now, my theory, and I don't mean this that it will apply in 1993, because like any CEO of a company, you see what's happening then. I'm not going to make any read my lips blank, blank, blank. That is not economics. That's politics. If they want somebody to do that, there are a lot of other people that you can pick up. My view is that if I had a choice between raising taxes and a freeze, I'd do the freeze. And in essence, have your your expenditure is frozen and let your revenues catch up to it. Now, having said that, I am in favor of a capital gains tax that's targeted, and I'd like to get into that if we have a chance. I would pay for that by raising taxes on the upper income, so I'd have 3 levels of taxation. So I'd figure out what the capital gains tax costs me, and dollar for dollar make it up by having a 3rd category. You know, people in my income bracket, we do very well. And there are a lot of people who don't do well. And for me to be paying the same tax as someone who's a teacher, the 2-teacher family, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And we're also going to look at other tax proposals to try to bring back some balance from where Reagan took us after 1980. But it seems to me if you have a government that is spending the percentage of GNP that we're now spending, it really has to be a different approach. I guess you have to use the microphones, so if you have a question, if you could go ahead.
Well, maybe I can attempt to try my voice here.
Well, I have been...
Senator Tsongas, I have known you over a quarter of a century now, and I salute your birth and your growth and your convictions.
But...
and I equally salute the strength of your convictions and patriotism about our state of economy. But again, what really concerns me most, and maybe that's selfish, since I crossed shores and adopted this country again, and I am happy and proud to be here, I am concerned and saddened about the state of the globe. We live at the speed and the technology that we experience and enjoy now in a global age. So maybe you can at least volunteer 2 or 3 of your top priority visions of the state of our foreign policy.
Well, that was as benign a butt as I could hope for. One area that I feel very strongly about is world population control. If you look at the problems we have as a society, as an environment, if you have world population control, world population just grow out of any proportion, you will eventually have the Earth explode. There's a limit to how many people can live on this Earth and still make it viable. If you go to any third world country and look at the mass immigration into the capital city, these cities don't work, a lot of them. It's only going to get worse. And Reagan Bush, as you know, because they want to appeal to one interest group, really did a lot to discourage population control around the world. Yeah, I can't tell you how strongly I feel about that, because that was saying, I'm going to take care of my political base. And whatever happens to future generations in a world of population gone berserk, it's not my responsibility. You know, there's a lot of Roger Ailes here. You know, nice man, but when you have people like that who whisper in your ear about what the politics are, it's like gun control. You know, strong anti-crime, anti-violence, but the Brady Bill, nah, that it speaks of an attitude. In terms of foreign policy, what I referred to, we have 3 choices. 1, isolationism. It's not possible. The United States is the moral leader of this world, and we're going to be involved whether we like it or not. The second alternative is Pax Americana, which is basically, as America, you go around, solve all the problems, and go broke while you're doing it. Can't do it. We are the world's greatest debtor nation, and everybody expects us to use our resources and our youth to solve everybody else's problems. It's just not possible. You know, if you think of all the coverage of the war, in which I think the United States really served this world with great distinction and courage. The fact is that people were watching it on televisions manufactured someplace else. And the commercials between news segments were commercials for products manufactured someplace else. And I think that is sort of a parable of our times that we should be very concerned about. The third option is what I call Pax Mundi, in which the whole world has responsibility for the peace of the world, so that burden sharing is burden sharing, and that we are not called upon to solve all the world's problems. And the idea that Japan and Germany, Japan had much more at stake in the Persian Gulf in terms of oil prices than we did, by definition, chose to bypass it. And both of those countries are now economically stronger than us after all this. It's not acceptable. And, you know, historically, when President Reagan used to negotiate with these countries, all he wanted from them was solidarity vis-a-vis the Soviets. So if we got that, he'd give away everything else. In the recent example of the 10-pound bag of rice at the exhibit in Japan bespeaks of a mindset. We have to make it clear to Japan, to Germany, and everybody else that a United States in economic decline serves no world peace. That is in their interest that we do well. And when we are involved in these kinds of things, they have to be involved as well. Now with the issue of the Kurds, it's got to be excruciating. If you had in place a Pax Mundi, in which the United Nations had military capability, and you had the World Court with more authority than it does now, you have a mechanism. And it seems to me that there are going to be a lot more examples like that in the future. And my heart really goes out to what is going on, but there's a lack of a mechanism that's in place to deal with these things. It's going to take a long time. There are a lot of issues of sovereignty and nationalism that will get in the way, but we have to start down that road.
In your pamphlet, you call for an atmosphere surrounding education which is accepting of innovation. In creating this atmosphere, what role, if any, do you see for choice in the public education, either within the public education system or in general?
Well, my view is that let's try everything. What we're doing now is not working, not to the extent it has to. And my view is everything you can think of, let's try it somewhere, let's see how it works, and then make a decision on it. But not to even attempt some of these things I would be strongly opposed to. I'm for experimentation across the board, even things that, well, let me give you an example. And there was an article in the Boston Globe that talked about Catholic education and the discipline. And, you know, growing up in Massachusetts, those students who went to Catholic school, and I grew up across the street from a Catholic high school, had great loyalty. And there's always a lot of joking about the discipline. Well, in fact, that discipline worked. And it seems to me that part of what's wrong here is that in the public schools is that there is not, whatever it is in a Catholic school, it could be a Greek Orthodox school, I'm not using any one particular. But what is it that creates a sense of discipline and students have a sense of having to adhere to some standard? That is a discussion, I think, that has to take place. And I think what a choice gives you is the entree into that discussion. When I was in the Peace Corps, some of the American Peace Corps volunteers tried to use American discipline in Ethiopia, which was no discipline. All right, we're nice people, and we don't do things like corporal punishment. What happened was the students began to disrespect them. And I did that the first year. The second year, I had one of my Ethiopian counterparts come up to me and say, look, Paul, you're not in America. You're in Ethiopia. And you have to adhere to the way we do things. Otherwise, the whole discipline of the school begins to erode because the students then expect us to act the way you do, and it doesn't work within our culture. So he told me that I had to use the thin rattan, thank you. Anything more than 6 letters I have trouble with. So when school reconvened, I had to do it, and it was quite an experience because I felt like I would do it and then be hauled off to jail because that's obviously illegal in this country. What I found out was that by doing that, I was adhering to their culture, and they expected it. And if one of the students would misbehave, the other students would yell in Amharic that he now deserved punishment. One of them would run out of the classroom and get the rattan and bring it in so I could do the punishment. It was excruciating. But what I learned in that situation was that there are cultural norms. And how you infuse a culture in children will vary from the United States to Ethiopia to someplace else. But we should be mindful of what it is that gets into a child's mind and says, there are things I have to do to be an appropriate citizen. I'm not sure what the answers are, but I think we should begin the search for them and not blindly say certain things are off the table. As far as I'm concerned, nothing's off the table. And what we're going to talk about is a lot of experimentation.
Hi. Next Wednesday, President Salinas of Mexico comes to Boston, and he's going to spend a week asking for trade instead of aid. He's going to ask for free trade instead of aid, and he's going to ask for a North American free trade zone. It's an issue which is splitting the Democratic Party, and the specific question isn't whether you want one in the long term, it's whether the President's fast-track authority should be renewed in June. What's your position on the North American Free Trade Zone and on fast track?
Let me just preface by saying I'm not in the Senate any longer. I don't have 48 people working for me. And so I'm not as up to speed on that, but let me give you my philosophy. There has to be a North American common market, in my opinion. You need something that is a counterpoint to Europe 92 and the Pacific Rim. The concern about the United States losing jobs gets us back to the issue that we discussed before about the German example. It seems to me that affluence in the United States and the capacity to have an economic, to be an economic power is a function of high-paid jobs. And my view is that if you spend all your time worrying about the loss of jobs that are on the lower end of the wage scales, rather than worrying about how you get the higher paid jobs, that you're spending your energy in the wrong direction. I think there have to be safeguards on worker safety, the environment, those kinds of things in the negotiations. But those who would say no to the free trade agreement, I would disagree with.
Senator, I would like to ask a question that touches on the twin topics of health care and the budget deficit. 2 years ago, a neighbor of mine died in Kansas City and left an estate of $200 million. But everybody in this room paid his medical bills because he died of kidney disease for 15 years. And kidneys are the only disease that are an entitlement under U.S. law. Would you apply a means test to the myriad entitlements under health care to lower the cost of health care and to lower the budget deficit?
Well, you used an example that I'm not familiar with, so I don't want to ad hoc my answer to you, but it's certainly on the face of it, it would sound logical. One other thing I would look at in terms of getting a handle on health care would be the role of lawyers in medical.
I am one.
You're forgiven. Maybe. And it seems to me that one area that we can deal with is trying to get as much litigation out of the medical field as possible, which means that doctors are going to have to be much more aggressive in monitoring their own. And if somebody is not a good doctor, they should be drummed out. of the practice. There's a doctor behind me somewhere. And I also think that we have to talk about putting limits on what lawyers have rights to in terms of awards. There is simply, I mean, Japan produces more engineers and fewer lawyers. We produce lawyers, not engineers. There is an inevitability to that equation that really scares me.
But we both are benefiting from that system.
You know, we're both benefiting, but, you know, I will benefit in the long term if my country does well. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. You know, I used to get 11 cents an hour in the Peace Corps, so everything's gravy for me.
I admire your attempt to run a campaign of ideas. However, it seems to me that during the past 2 elections, any of the candidates that attempted to run a campaign of ideas fell victim either to the warm and fuzzy.
Well, that's victimizing, for sure.
The warm and fuzzy Reagan-esque style, or else to hot-button topics, as in the Bush campaign. Why should you succeed where all the others couldn't?
Well, I think a campaign of ideas is at least something, when it's all said and done, you can go back home and feel good about. Secondly, people may wonder why I'm doing this, but, you know, I've never lost an election. When I was elected to the Lowell City Council, I'd been away for 10 years. I went back to Lowell because I couldn't think of any other place to go to get elected. And I knew one person well enough. I called him up and became my campaign manager. And a year later, I was elected to the Lowell City Council. And everybody said, what they said to me was, look, you run this year, get your name out, then you can run in 91. 71. Yeah, there's something eerie about all that, but I'm not sure what it is. I won, and everybody said, well, that's a fluke. Okay. Well, then I ran for county commissioner. Those of you from this area, there was the Middlesex County, which is Cambridge up to Lowell, down to Ashby. It's 54 cities and towns. We put together a reform slate. Everyone said that was impossible. You couldn't beat the county machine. We beat him in the primary. I topped the ticket. Everybody said, well, that's a fluke. 2 years later, I ran for Congress. The congressman had defeated now Senator, then congressional candidate John Kerry by a wide margin. And I said, you couldn't defeat him. I did by something like 21 points. And I said that was a fluke. And then in 1978, I ran for the Senate, with all due respects to Bob Turney here. The Boston Globe dismissed me as an obscure first-term congressman, which was very insulting because I was an obscure second term. The New York Times wrote me off as terminably earnest. Think about that one for a while. I remember going home and lying in bed thinking, is that good or bad? I feel like I should have a political consultant to tell me whether that was something I should be proud of or upset about. And I won. And the campaign and the primary was very difficult in November. So I think I know something about how to run from behind. In fact, the 2 worst races I ran were when I ran for re-election. I ran for re-election to the Lowell City Council. I came in 7th. Now, can you imagine if I ever became president, the 6 who beat me, well, they must be saying to themselves, I should be there. I beat him. I'm the one who should be there. One job that we do have, I think I know something about politics and how you take ideas and use the symbols, is where you do a press conference, how you do it, what's behind you, those kinds of things. So you can take a complex idea and translate it so that the average person can have a sense of it pretty quickly. Republicans make no bones about doing that, and we should not be ashamed of it as well. If you look at what's happening to the economy, that I think we've got marvelous, terrible issues, and we have to bring them home to the American people. So I'm not politically naive, and I recognize the need to do things that go beyond 83-page papers. Let me take two more, and then we'll let you go.
This summer, Dukakis stood where you stood and said that he also ran a campaign of ideas but lost to style over substance, basically, and media mudslinging. And I was wondering what you plan to do to try and continue to have this be a campaign of ideas and not let the campaign go down the way it did before.
Well, I think part of what happened last time was, I think it's basic in politics. When you get attacked, you better fight back. And I'm going to bleed, but I've got to make other people bleed too. And I think any that's not part of my health care. It seems to, I feel such anger about what Reagan Bush have done to the legacy we leave to our children that I'll have no trouble fighting back. If you look at his decision on his vice presidential choice, yeah, I don't blame Dan Quayle. My heart goes out to him. No, I'm very serious, because if you think of what he's been through and what his family has had to endure for these 2 years, it's not pleasant. I know what it means to be in that situation. But it wasn't his fault. I suppose you can argue he shouldn't have taken it, but everybody's in the Senate thinks that they're ordained, preordained to be in the White House. But for the president to have made that decision, to say no to a Bob Dole, to say no to a Jack Kemp. If you wanted to go to Indiana, you could have. Dick Lugar was a very respected member of the Senate. That was Roger Ailes. And all I have to do is think about it, and I get angry. So this is one person who was quite prepared to use the bite as well as the substance in this campaign.
As a loyal Democrat, I just wanted to point out that after winning a war much more significant than the Iraq War, Winston Churchill lost an election because he neglected the home front. So that might, the president's popularity might be evanescent and seem very different in a year's time if the economy continues to deteriorate.
I would not run against Winston Churchill, but I appreciate your point.
You're not.
Yeah. I deeply resent you using a better line than I have. So, you know, there's an old expression in politics: if you take questions, you invariably stay one question too long. Well, this proves the point. So.
The economic problems we face are the point of my question. You have been at some point labeled as a neoliberal. Those who find their philosophical roots in President Kennedy's economic misspeech in his inaugural address. And while certainly we have to be concerned with improving the efficiency of our social programs, such as the workwear program that Governor Dukakis began, I think that if you look at the stock market crash, and I'd like to draw your attention to an article in Forbes magazine of March 18th on page 74 about the economic trends that we have now. It talks about the contractive cycle and such, that the stock market crash was caused by problems which really haven't been dealt with, and that perhaps the solutions of the 60s would be better replaced by some of the ideas and concepts of the 30s, when economic times were much more severe than those President Kennedy spoke of when he talked of getting the country moving again. I think we could very well be, as that article points out, on the eve of a depression. Any comment?
That's a heck of a way to leave. I don't think we are. I think, let me answer you this way. I serve on 7 corporate boards, spend a lot of time talking to businessmen about what's going on. I think I know how they think, how they make decisions. Whenever I have that conversation, I end up with one question to every businessman I ever spoke to, and I said, tell me, if we got our act together, could we compete? And not once has anyone ever said to me no. And that's part of what this is about. If I had asked that question and they said, look, you know, history's against us. We're just going to be a second-rate economic power, and there's nothing we can do about it, then I wouldn't run. I would just stay home, make my money, protect my family. This is a great country. We are a great people, and to see us slide should be an insult to our pride. It insults my pride. And we are the party, the Democrats, who have heart. And so if we can make the economy work, we're the ones who are going to have the discussion about having a society that works. I grew up during Lowell's recession. I think I know what it feels like. But I guess I have some trembling as well. But I have enough discussions with people that I must say I have a lot of confidence about where we can go.
Can I just point out that I happen to forecast a stock market crash based on Professor Galbraith's book and an article he wrote in Atlantic Monthly magazine, which confirmed my thinking of the historical parallels between the 20s and the 80s. And anywhere from Samuel Hayes, the investment banking professor at Harvard Business School, to Margaret Thatcher's Commerce Secretary, Sir Keith Josephs, told me I was wrong at the time. So businessmen are probably the last ones to know about such things. I'd ask you to consult with historians and such.
Well, I will consult with historians, but, you know, if